Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Europe and in Luxembourg. And today in Luxembourg, which means we are proudly powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the Media Center of the University of Luxembourg. And this also means that we have here today a researcher based in Luxembourg, and that is Dr. Mila Marinova, who is a cognitive psychologist working at the University of Luxembourg. A lot of Luxembourgs in the introduction. Mila is also a great source of reliable knowledge on Instagram. I checked many times, so really believe me, and do check yourself as well, because you can find her at dr.mila.marinova on Instagram. Mila, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to this podcast and to this episode.
Very happy to hear that. All these nice words. Now I'm going to I should give you a difficult question from the beginning after being so nice. No, I don't know if it's difficult, but we're defining, and we're starting with, of course, your job. So what does a cognitive psychologist do?
That is a great question, actually, because, when you typically say that you're a psychologist, the first thing that people think about is, behavioral therapy or kind of more clinical settings, which is great because this is also part of psychology. But psychology is a big, big, big field, and cognitive psychology is part of it. And what we are doing is basically, as cognitive psychologists, we are studying everything about the processes of thinking. So processes like perception, how the thoughts originate, what are the mechanisms that drive our thinking processes, learning, retrieval of information processing. We also study things like attention, working memory, language, and in my case, I also study numerical cognition.
This means looking at the brain? As simple as that, or not really?
We do look at the brain. So depending on what type of work we do, we can use behavioral methodologies, which is basically measuring kind of behavioral responses such as button presses or vocal responses to certain stimuli that we show to people. But of course, what we are also interested in, specifically if you're doing more neurocognitive psychology, is that you're also looking in how certain things are implemented in the brain. For example, if I'm interested in how fast people can compare two numbers, I can measure their responses via button presses on a computer, let's say. But I can also look at their brain when they're performing this task. And you can use very many different technologies for that. You can use functional magnetic resonance imaging. You can use electroencephalography, which is what we often use in our research group here. You can also use functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It really depends on your research question and what you want to look at.
When I have guests here, I often like to kind of move into their worlds for those 40 minutes and then, of course, move out and move to something else. And what I mean with that is what always interests me, I sometimes go to conferences and these are just doors to completely different worlds, but most of the times I can't really follow everything, right? So I get more or less that there is a heated debate, but I don't understand exactly why. So if you took me to a conference that you would go to, what are the heated debates between you cognitive psychologists?
Great question. So first of all, the debates would differ as to what kind of conferences you're going to. So if you go to a conference that it's more domain specific, so more within the concrete research field that I'm working in, there it would be very limited to the specific field. So for example, we will question the definition of certain concepts, methodologies, new research evidence, and so on and so forth. If you go to bigger conferences, for example, something like the Cognitive Science Society conference, where it's everything about cognition, there you can have very many different debates. And I think if you look at, for example, some of kind of a foundational books that people can read about cognitive psychology, including popular science books, if you wish, I think some of the debates that are really have been there for a very long time, for example, nature versus nurture debate. So to what degree our genes decide what our fate and behaviors would be, and to what extent this is malleable by our environment. the question about consciousness, where does it come from? Can it be reduced simply to kind of brain impulses, or even more versus the more philosophical debates of the heart, question for consciousness? So this is for sure a very pertinent topic still until today. The role of emotions in cognition is also something that gains popularity recently. I think it's partly because previously it has been thought that, rational decision-making and decision-making processes, they should be studied in isolation from emotion and attitudes. And nowadays we see that actually picking apart emotions from the decision-making process is actually really hard. So kind of the role of emotion and affect in cognition, I think it's something that it's also very, very important debate-wise. In this day and age, of course, artificial intelligence is a very popular topic. Is our mind operating like a computer? To what extent is actually this metaphor correct and where it is not? There is actually a great book by David Eagleman, a kind of a science communicator I really like. It's called Life Wired. And for those of you that are interested in debates like this, that would be, I think, a really nice place to start. So yeah, I would say those are one of the kind of on the top of my mind, those are the things that we would debate for sure.
Okay, so big questions.
Yes, the hard questions of life for sure.
And what happens is like you have two camps, or do you cross very much? Or, I always wondered with these, especially when you specialize in certain fields, right? How actually are you shaped with your research to change your mind? Or do you start in the same place and you stay there?
This is a great question as well. There are a lot of great questions from you, Hannah. There is this joke that I don't know who told me when I started my PhD, or maybe I read it somewhere, I don't remember. But the joke is that in the 18th century, two professors had a fight, and no one remembers what the fight was for, but now you have to pick a side. And I think it is true that, in science, everything is debatable, and there is always, a camp A and a camp B. Personally, one of my credos is that I go where the evidence goes. I think early in your career, especially, it's very difficult to not take a side, because this is when, as a researcher, you're building your identity. And you're also working under a supervisor, and they usually come from some tradition, right? It's normal. It's part of the human nature. And I think that along the way, you have to set your priorities straight and decide where you would go as a researcher. So do you go where your beliefs go, which is a possible way for some, but I personally always tried to go where the evidence goes. And if the data shows me that my hypothesis is not supported, then that's fine. That's actually how it was supposed to work, right? We are supposed to be falsifying our hypothesis, not actively looking for ways to prove them right. For me, I always try to see science as a spectrum and as a full of nuances. And maybe at the two extremes of the spectrum, you have camp A and camp B. And when you're doing your experiments and when you're interpreting your data, you rarely can put it straightforward into one camp. There are usually many ways that you can interpret the data, and you go with the best possible explanation at that stage. So for me, that took some time to build this confidence that, you're not your data. Obviously, there is part of you in the research that you're doing, so it's difficult not to take it completely personally. But I think this is something that really helped me early in my career, that I'm here to be a servant of science, and what this data shows has nothing to do with my own personality. So it is what it is, and I go where the data go. Pending that the experiment was done right, so the data, I can trust the data.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. One of my favorite posts of you on Instagram is the one about, what every scientist would wish others would understand when they publish something, right? So the proper analysis of an article that you produce, because of course I have to read a lot of articles, and I have to say that for me this was also a learning curve, because I started with journalism background and reading it absolutely wrongly. Then I, of course, spent more time on science communication, and I understood how I should read it, which of course also means that even if I know where I should pay attention to, the problem will be my understanding of the methodologies, right? So if I know that this is the key here, I will not know whether the methodology was chosen well or not, except for maybe the sample or whatever else, like very, very basic. So here's how far I can go. But still, for those of you who are interested, do check it out. I think it's pinned on your profile,
I think so, yes.
You should easily find it. So it's a good point. But let's now move on to your specialization, of course, because we are about 10 minutes in and we still haven't really started. So we're going to talk about numbers. I love numbers. But it's very interesting that when people say that, they might be meaning different things. For me, loving numbers means loving counting. I just spent all my life counting different things. And some people find it a bit strange, I have to say, because it turns out not everyone counts, just like it turns out not everyone perceives the world the same way we think, right? So it's the same here. So I'm very, very excited to be talking about it. And first of all, just starting from the very beginning, before you tell us what you do, I think we can ask the pop quiz question because it is related to what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
So if you can ask the question and listeners remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
My pop quiz question for the listeners of this episode is, how is it called when a person perceives numbers as colors?
Exactly, listeners. Don't Google, as I always say, listen now to the episode. We will reveal the answer at the end. Okay, and now numbers. So first of all, maths has very bad press, I would say. And, listeners, you might have noticed this one episode I talked to Bruno Teu about maths, and we even titled the episode Maths, That Word You Shouldn't Mention. And it was really a quote from Bruno because he said when he does outreach activities, he never tells people, okay, this is maths, now do it. He just says, look, there's a game here for you. And then maybe they get involved. So what's going on? Why are we like this with maths and numbers?
Why don't we like maths, or why do we feel anxious about mathematics?
I think, why do we feel anxious?
That's a great question. Oh my God. I think a lot of people can actually relate to feeling anxious when you have to do mathematics. For example, if you think about, doing a test at school, for me, it was also very kind of anxiety provoking. And actually, from our research in numerical cognition, we know that there is such a thing called mathematics anxiety. And this mathematics anxiety is different than general anxiety. So it's not that simply because you are a generally anxious person, you will for sure also be mathematically anxious. There is also anxiety related with reading, and those are all different components or different constructs. So we know that it's not just, something that it's explained by general anxiety. So another thing that it's important to mention about this math anxiety is that it tends to also affect females more compared to males. It typically emerges somewhere middle of primary school, so let's say around 5th to 7th grade, and then it peaks in high school. And there are several explanations as to why this may happen. So initially, towards the end of kindergarten or at the very beginning of the primary school, we typically don't observe this kind of math anxiety, and we don't observe the sex differences in math anxiety, meaning that we don't see a reliable difference between boys and girls with respect to their anxiety in mathematics. And there are several reasons why people can feel more anxious with mathematics. So there is a component to this anxiety where if you have had a previous bad experiences with mathematics, you may get into this vicious cycle where because you have had previous bad experiences with mathematics, you develop the concept that you're just not good at it. And because you think you're not good at it, you just don't put your full cognitive resources into it. So you just say, okay, I'm just bad at it. I'm just not going to even try. And then, of course, the result would be, let's say, failing on the math test. There is also the hypothesis that people that experience more math anxiety, they would perform worse at mathematics test exactly because anxiety is taking cognitive resources. So, for example, when we are anxious or when we are nervous, we have a reduced working memory capacity and we have reduced attentional capacity. And so this is where we can actually also not be able to use our full resources and subsequently fail to complete the math test. And so there were several hypotheses, one of which is that, okay, if you have a limited working memory capacity, or if you're struggling with the so-called cognitive load, in principle, you would also struggle more if you experience anxiety. And then the other perspective is more related with kind of, your personal attitudes and your self-concept of whether you can actually do or not do this. And then for people that have had more bad experiences with math anxiety and they have, got into this vicious cycle of I'm just not good at it, they would, of course, tend to avoid doing mathematics, avoid kind of exercising this skill. And that, of course, would later lead to lower performance. You also have environmental factors. And one of them could be, for example, stereotypes. If you from an early age tell to a child or to a young woman that, okay, just girls are not good at mathematics, of course, this can affect their attitudes towards math. So I would say that to summarize, how anxious we feel about mathematics can have cognitive components that are related with, our abilities to sustain attention, the capacity of our working memory. It can also have components related to our personal attitudes, so our self-concept with respect to our ability to do mathematics. And of course, there are also environmental factors that are related with how mathematics is taught at schools, explicit or implicit gender-related stereotypes. And also one big factor that we know plays a role in how anxious, especially children, are for mathematics is actually the teacher and the teacher's attitude. So for the teachers out there, your attitudes matter.
Especially in the beginning, as you're saying, because, if it stays with you for life. But it's a bit eye-opening, I have to say, because I was the one that had to help numerous people with their math tests and try to, help them excel at it. And then later on, I moved on to teach languages. And it was kind of a similar experience in the sense that I just once in a while had a student that just couldn't get it. And I do believe that my attitude was on the positive side. I hope it was. I was not causing more anxiety. But I just had people who, I tried all the possible methods. I was trying to educate myself on how I could explain it, we could create a better environment and all this. And it just didn't stick. It just didn't work out. And I was always wondering, what on earth is it? And of course, my lay perspective was, there are people who are good at it and there are people who are bad at it. And that's it, let's face it.
Yeah, there are people that are great at mathematics and there are people that are less great at mathematics. And again, I think it's a really complex interplay between the cognitive components, the personal attitudes, and also the environment. And of course, depending on how these things are weighted and what are the predispositions that a person has, plus a favorable environment, plus favorable, mindset, this can definitely help boost someone's learning. So I think that there are no two cases alike, although the learning mechanisms and the information processing mechanisms are more or less universal across people. Of course, there are big individual differences of how people learn and how they actually process information. So that might be the case that you had experienced there.
Probably. Does it mean that we really need to work with maths teachers more? There should be a different way of teaching maths?
I would say yes. So I'm not an educational psychologist and I don't profess how teachers should necessarily approach their teaching methods. But I think that definitely how we teach at schools should be science-informed. And definitely should take into account how the brain learns, how the brain develops, and what would be the more appropriate methods to teach certain subjects based on the pupil's age. And of course, there are also neurodivergent cases where then the learning processes are a little bit different compared to the typical population. So that's something that it's important. But I think one of the ways that we can already start this change also for teachers is that to be aware that there are things that influence how children learn mathematics. Math anxiety can be an issue. So, for example, this is something that it's not very often discussed and a lot of people actually don't know about the existence of this math anxiety. And I don't blame them because it's probably also not very much communicated. But knowing that it exists definitely will help. Another thing is that we should remember also that language, although we tend to not think of mathematics and language as two related factors, this is also something that it's important. And we know from research that language skills and vocabulary knowledge tend to predict mathematics performance. So it's not simply, teaching mathematics super abstract and as if it's, a domain of its own. But it's a difficult subject and it requires a lot of guided and instructional learning where different things are important, including language.
And this is good that you mentioned that, because I also wanted to move on to this, and probably then we will come back as well to a bit deeper understanding of in general numerical cognition. So we're in Luxembourg, right? So of course language has to be discussed. And as it turns out, language is also discussed, as you mentioned, in studying mathematics. So is it helping or not? What's going on?
So being a multilingual is both blessing and a curse, as I like to say. I think definitely learning a lot of languages and being able to speak in different languages has both kind of cognitive benefits. So there is some data showing that it can be neuroprotective. So it's good for your brain to be able to speak, many languages. It's also practically good because, if you live nearby many countries that speak different languages, it's easy for you to adapt to the environment that you have to be. When it comes to education and when it comes to learning in multilingual environment, this can be a little bit of a challenge though. Because what we know from the research is that typically people or individuals that are L2 speakers, so by L2 speakers I mean speakers that are not native to the language of instruction in schools, they tend to underperform compared to L1 speakers. So this multilingualism sometimes comes at a cost. Part of my research is really about learning to count and learning the logic of counting in multilingual context. And for example, some of the preliminary findings that we see, so these are not yet peer-reviewed, just to put it as a disclosure here, is that children that are L2 speakers, so they don't speak the language of instruction, which in the kindergarten is typically Luxembourgish, they tend to struggle counting. So they're counting less, or they're less proficient in counting compared to the L1 speakers. And the tricky part is that we know that counting plays a very important role, plays a gatekeeping role to later mathematical competencies. And so it does not mean that if you struggle to count from an early age, you'll definitely be bad in mathematics. Not at all, but there could be some developmental delay in when certain skills are acquired. And on top of that, if an individual does not have a sufficient understanding and proficiency of the language of instruction, when you encounter subjects, let's say like geometry or more abstract mathematics that require a lot of instruction and understanding of the language, then of course you might be failing not because you cognitively cannot fathom, not because you cognitively cannot process this, but simply because you struggle with the proficiency and because you don't sufficiently understand what you're supposed to be doing, what you're supposed to be learning. So there are definitely challenges when you're learning mathematics in a multilingual environment.
Does it mean that if you let the children just, let's say, produce the answers in their native language, their performance would improve, or it's more about the language of the instruction?
This is a difficult question because there would be a lot of variability. So multilingualism is a spectrum, and it's very difficult sometimes to work with such populations because it depends on many factors, whether a child learned the languages simultaneously, whether they were learned from birth or sequentially. So it's a tricky question, but some anecdotal evidence when we were collecting the data is that children do not necessarily count higher in their native language unless they practice this with their, let's say, parents or peers. So the language of instruction remains very, very important throughout development of the numerical skills. And this is also something that we see later on in adults. For example, we see in the data that generally the first language of mathematics instruction tends to yield better performance. So I would say that the language of instruction does play a very important role, but maybe for children or for individuals that are non-native, there should be additional emphasis on mastering this language of instruction. For example, through teaching it formally as a foreign language. Because often the policy is that, we just start teaching in a certain language and then children will just figure it out because their brains are, amazing. And they are. But in certain cases, especially when you have to master difficult subjects, I believe that teaching it as a foreign language, as a kind of an additional subject, that would maybe help in mastering the language of instruction, yes.
Especially being in Luxembourg, where this is not the only switch, right? Because we're talking about the switch in the very beginning, but then you will have, again, the switch from German into French, and then maths is in French. So I also wonder whether then the performance switches again because of that switch, right?
Yeah, that's super interesting, actually. We started doing some research on that as well, because exactly this moment where students switch from German to French at the beginning at high school is also a very interesting period for us as a scientist to examine. We have some preliminary data showing that, at the beginning of high school, when this switch has just happened, L2 speakers tend to be more anxious because, again, they have to do this switch. So at the beginning, there is this anxiety that, oh my God, now I have to do, mathematics in a different language. And on top of that, if this language is different than your mother tongue, so you're not only anxious because it's mathematics, but you're also anxious because it's language that is different, from your mother tongue. But interestingly, we have seen also in these preliminary results that with time, this anxiety kind of decreases. So as children become, or as the pupils become more proficient in doing mathematics in French, this anxiety for doing math in French kind of decreases over time. And funny enough, we see that in adults, they have very peculiar preferences. So in one study, we asked them, in which language do you prefer to do your math exams? And in which language you prefer to take exams in general? And when you ask adults, they would say that, okay, I prefer to do mathematics exam in French, but I would prefer to do general exams in German. So they would stick with their, language of instruction in general, but if they have to do mathematics exam, they would do it in French. This is also partially because they have just been out of high school, and, that was the language of instruction. But on top of that, if you ask people in what language you would count, then they would most probably tell you their first language of instruction or their mother tongue. So it's a really very interesting mixture, and it's a very situational. And that it's one of the things about multilingualism. We can develop kind of environment and case-specific vocabularies. So for example, if you ask me to explain my research in my native tongue, which is Bulgarian, that's gonna take me a lot of time and it's gonna cost me a lot of nerves. While my vocabulary in English, it's bigger, related with scientific content. It's really very, very interesting environment to study, mathematics and multilingualism.
Yes, for sure it is. And, and I guess all of us here have some experience as well, especially if you have children here. I mean, I'm observing my children, and it's fascinating how they absorb the language in certain contexts. And then the language is really context specific. And also the number thing. Which I personally, as I speak a few languages, I personally noticed that the moment we talk serious stuff, I don't know, family budget or whatever, there's only one acceptable language we can do it in, English. Except for, of course, my native language, but it's out of question in this particular case, right? It's like the moment I have to discuss it in Italian, I'm like, no, sorry. It's serious stuff here. I just need to get it. But still, Italian would not be so as stressful as German or French, because I think that both of those languages have very special way of talking about numbers. Yes. That you have to add as well. I mean, I feel that my brain has to get on a second gear with German, kind of, as we non-natives would say, doing the reverse with bigger numbers, right? Yeah. And with French, that at certain moments doesn't just say 80, but says something else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that must be adding too, if this is not your native language.
It's absolutely adding, yes. There is a research showing that what we call transparency of the language. So, for example, the counting system in English is more transparent comparing to the counting systems, let's say, in German or in French. That also adds a level of complexity when a child is learning to count. So the procedure that they have to learn in German is a little bit different compared to the procedure that they have to learn if they were, let's say, an English speaker or a speaker of a Slavic language. Because, for example, in Bulgarian, the numbers from 10 to 20 are a little bit easier to learn because we just add, 10 plus 1 or 10 plus 2. So it's a little bit more transparent in that sense. So definitely this inversion or having a vigesimal system, that also adds a level of complexity, yes, to this whole process.
And that's not all, because, when I think about counting, I just think exactly numbers and counting, but there are also concepts you need to integrate as well.
Yeah.
What are they? Like, how do we count actually?
Wow, that's an amazing question. And that's actually one of the research lines that I have. So super interesting. There is no clear answer as to what a child needs to know, in order to arrive at the complete concept of number. So we know that there are certain processes. So at the beginning, when we initially learn to count, we can even learn to count as a song, right? I mean, you can easily see a young child saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but they don't necessarily understand what they mean. So this is where they just know the words. They can produce the words. One of the first things that the child needs to understand is the so-called the cardinality of the number. That if you have, let's say, a string of numbers, that the last item in the set can denote the number of the whole set. In the experiments, we address this with what we call given number task. So we can, for example, ask a child to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We, mark until when they make a mistake. And then we want to check how well they know these numbers. And we do that by usually giving them, let's say, a bowl of colorful balls. And we have a doll that's called certain name, let's say Brian or whatever you want to call this doll. And then we say, can you please give Brian like 2 balls? And then the child takes a certain number of balls, puts it in front of the doll, and then we ask to count, to check if this is the correct number. And you would see that it's really funny that in the beginning, children would easily learn 1, 2, 3, maybe even. But then until they become cardinality principle knowers, so they understand the bigger numbers, quite a few months can pass. So it is a long, difficult process for a child. And it's really interesting to see that, for example, they know 1, 2, 3, 4, so they are able to give, the exact number. And then suddenly you ask for 5, and they'll just give you all the balls. They can be 20, right? So because they don't have an understanding of what 5 is, so they would give you everything. Funny enough, you can try this with ChatGPT as well. So there is an evidence showing that actually these Gen AI models, they still don't have a concept for number. There was a research actually from a group in Padova that showed that if you ask a ChatGPT or these generative AI models to give you a number, they just give you all kind of weird stuff. For example, give me 4, and then it gives you 5 or 6, or it just does not give you a number. It just have difficulty understanding what a 4 is. And so in that sense, these models behave like, 2 or 3-year-old children. So it was really, fascinating to see this data. So if you don't have a child at home, you can try this experiment, with ChatGPT. Just ask it for 4 emojis or something like that and see that it's not going to return 4. So cardinality principle, so being able to understand that the last item in a set denotes the whole set, it takes quite a lot of time for a child. And we usually, data-wise, we conclude that a child is a cardinality principle knower once they can generate the numbers above 5. So typically once they learn to give the numbers about 5, then that it's easily to learn the cardinality principle of the rest. Another thing that child needs to learn in order to build the concept of number is also the successor function and the predecessor function. So the successor function is that every natural number can have a successor, so n plus 1. And of course, the predecessor is that every number has a predecessor, right? N minus 1. And also, this is also a very challenging task for a very young child because they usually can generate the next number or the preceding number once they know a concrete number range. So once they have mastered, let's say, the numbers up until 5, they can operate within that range. But really building a concept of number and mastering the logic of counting requires from them to understand that they can always add 1, which is not a very easy thing to understand. And so these are the very, very first steps in learning the logic of counting. So understanding the cardinality, understanding the succession, and also to a certain extent understanding that numbers come in a specific order. So it's not just random, like you can't just put numbers anywhere and you got it. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Oh, I'm thinking about, of course, my children and how they process them. My daughter is 4, so it's exactly that moment when it's kind of switching sometimes, but not exactly. Do you know why are we able to grasp the concept until 4 as children?
Yeah, so there is a lot of variability at that age. So this is a very wild period of development. Actually, it's not a guarantee that at the age of 4 they would arrive at certain, right? I mean, it can be anywhere between 3 and 5 or 3 and 6. We have had some children in experiments that are, 3 years old and they can count up until 20 and they could give you all the balls, and there is a lot of inter-individual variability. So no 2 children are alike. But there are a lot of things that happen at this stage, right? Also the cognitive level, this is where the first stages of also executive functioning development. Also, this is when the children also start going to the kindergarten. And this is where a little bit more formal instruction happens. So definitely that natural maturation of the brain paired with the, going to formal schooling system, that also definitely helps at developing the concept of number. So it's not purely, just on their own.
Staying on the topic of concept of number, there's one more thing that you write in your research, and these are numerosities. What are they?
So numerosity is a very domain-specific terminology that we used. And how is this going to be defined depends also sometimes on the research paper that you read. In general, we refer to numerosity as individual items in a set that can have certain number. Let's put it this way. What I prefer to use in my research is sometimes non-symbolic numbers. And this is exactly a number or numerousness of certain collection of items expressed without using symbols. So expressed without using digits or number words. So if you think about, for example, a pile of oranges in the supermarket that you see them and you can perceive them and you say, this is about 10. Then this is actually representing a number in a non-symbolic way as a collection of items, yes.
And do we process them the same way or not, as numbers?
So there is some common ground, and there are things that are distinct between non-symbolic numbers or numerosities and symbolic numbers. So on one hand, numerosities can be perceived not necessarily precisely. So you can look at, let's say, a pile of oranges and say, this is about 10. But it might as well be 15 or 20, right? So you have an approximate estimation of numerosities. Unless you have a very small number of these non-symbolic numbers or these numerosities, and if the number is below 5, then we do what's called subitizing. So subitizing is really processing a small number of items very precisely. So we see and we know, this is 4. I don't need to count. I don't need to do any more operations. But anything above 5 is really imprecise. Now, these numerosities and these non-symbolic numbers, they can be processed visually based on different visual cues, and they're a little bit differently processed compared to the symbolic numbers. So the symbolic numbers are something that are, culturally evolved. It's something, that we use in our culture, and they denote precise numbers. So there is no question about what the digit 1 denotes or what the number word 2 means. So there is no question about that. And also the level of our brain, we do process them a little bit differently. So we do know from research that these non-symbolic numbers and also the symbolic numbers, they do have some overlap in the brain, and that is typically seen within the intraparietal sulcus, which is a little bit deeper structure in the parietal part of the brain. So this is where it is assumed that some abstract representation of number is taking place. So irrespectively of whether you see 10 oranges or the digit 10, or you hear the number word 10, some abstract representation will be activated there. But also we know from research, including our own, that these symbolic numbers, the digits and the number words, they can also activate parts that are related with the language network. Especially in multilinguals, that of course makes sense, but also we know that there is a number form area, if I'm not mistaken, else you're gonna correct me afterwards. So they partially overlap in the brain, but we also know that the brain networks associated with numerical processing can also be format dependent, in a sense that there is some specific regions that are associated with the processing also of digits and number words, but there are also regions that are commonly activated irrespectively of the format in which we process numbers.
Am I right to assume that these are the concepts that non-human animals are familiar with or not?
Yeah, so the question of whether animals or non-verbal species have concepts is a whole another debate, because there is a field of psychology that would say that if you don't have a language, you don't have a concept. So that's a whole another debate. But there is an evidence showing that we have this preverbal number system that it's sometimes in the literature referred to as the approximate number system. It is something that is shared across species. So there is a lot of research with animal species and non-human primates as well that show that animals do have some number sense. But the symbolic part of the numbers is something that they don't have. But yes, animals can perceive numbers.
One more thing, as we are in the field of numbers and whatever, I was just wondering, when you meet a mathematician, what do you talk about?
That's very interesting. Unfortunately, I don't speak with that many mathematicians, but I think that they're usually very fascinated to learn that there is more to numbers than pure math, right? I mean, than what they have been, dealing in school, or, these high-level numerical representations. And when they start hearing, about the approximate number system and the influence of language and all these things, and they're like, wow, there is actually more to math, right? Because one of the things that are so fascinating about mathematics and numbers, and one of the reasons why I stuck in this field in the first place, is because numbers are something that is abstract. You cannot see them on the street, right? You have not seen the number 2 walking by. I mean, if you do see, please let me know. It is something that is constructed in our mind. And that's so fascinating to me, because mathematics and numbers are such a huge part of our life, and they enable so many of these amazing technologies and advancements that we have, but they don't objectively exist. Of course, there are, fields in philosophy and then, fields in mathematics that would tell you that numbers somehow objectively exist. Maybe they do, I don't know. But from point of view of cognitive psychologists, they are mental representations. They are not something that you can touch.
So these discussions must be very interesting if you do get to meet a mathematician.
Absolutely. I have had a couple of discussions with philosophers, though. Of course, I do have a background in philosophy, so I could rarely avoid that. But I would enjoy actually really in-depth discussions with mathematicians for sure. So if someone is interested, they can absolutely engage in such discussions.
Totally. They can find you online, and moving to the online part, right?
Yes.
So we have mathematicians, but we have the whole general public, as we like to call them, or whatever, the people out there that might be receptive to your posts. So you write about quite a lot of different subjects. It's not only numbers. How does it start? So is it because there is a news item and you say, okay, now I have to tell people what the science says? Or is it because you went to a conference and there was such a debate that you said, all right, now I'm going to write about it? Where do you look for subjects?
Everywhere. I'm someone that does not like to stay put in my own research. One of the reasons is because I need to be stimulated mentally all the time, and I'm a very curious person, so I search for interesting things everywhere. And psychology and cognitive psychology is really one of these fields that, because we study human mind and because we study thinking processes, there is literally no limit to it, right? I mean, it's fascinating. It's basically understanding what makes people tick. Most of the posts that I go for are, of course, inspired by the things that I'm interested in, that I think are maybe important, or that I consider maybe it would be interesting for my audience. But sometimes I do react also on societal events and things that are happening in the world. For example, I have had a couple of posts that are related with critical thinking and leadership and so on and so forth. And these, of course, have been kind of my way to respond to certain events that are happening right now in the world. And they have had quite some positive reactions. So I get this as a sign that people need this and they're interested in these things. Other part of inspiration comes from my desire to also make academia better, to the best of my abilities, of course, better for the next generation of scientists. So I sometimes identify gaps or kind of things that are missing, according, from my view, in the training or in the approach that we have to master students, to bachelor students, or even to doctoral students. And then this becomes an inspiration for posts like that. I also read a lot of books, and I try to keep up with the popular science books that are coming out. And if I read something that is, interesting, and I think that could be turned into something more actionable, so something that people can do, something with this information, then I would probably create a post about it.
Okay, so loads of different sources, as usual,
absolutely,
right?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of different sources.
Yeah, for sure. But there's also the source of inspiration, Elizabeth. I'm revealing something about the pub quiz question that we have right now. So this is the moment to solve the pub quiz question. If you can remind our listeners what it was about, and then listeners, you'll get the answer.
Yes. So the pub quiz question was, how is it called, or what is it called, when numbers are perceived with having colors? And the answer is, it's called synesthesia.
Okay, and what is it then?
What is synesthesia? And then I'm going to tell a story about how I know about this condition. So synesthesia is a neurological condition. It's not a disease. It's just a condition where stimulation in one modality triggers a stimulation in another modality as well. So for example, if you see a number, you also perceive this number as having a color. It can also happen with seeing a letter and perceiving that this letter has a color. So it's basically a cross-modal experience. And there are different explanations of why this happens. And one of the explanations is that certain regions in the brain are hyper-connected to each other, or that there has been early in development created an automatic associations between a certain type of stimuli, let's say a number and a color. And there are different types of synesthesia. You can have a color grapheme synesthesia, which is the example I gave, or you can also have visuospatial synesthesia, where you associate, let's say, months and days of the week. You can see them kind of mapped in a spatial map in your head. So it's a very, very interesting condition. And the reason why I know about it is, and actually it was one of the reasons why I got into numerical cognition, is that one of my best friends, she had a synesthesia. And I learned about it in a very funny way, is that we were debating about the precise number of a phone of a friend that we were trying to call. And then I was like, is this the right number that I'm calling? And then she said, no, it's not, because it's missing an orange. And I was like, what do you mean it's missing an orange? Like, what's going on here? And then she was like, yeah, here there should be in the middle an orange. I was like, are you okay? And then she asked me, yeah, but don't you see numbers colored? I was like, no, I don't see them colored. And this is when I learned that there is such a condition, synesthesia. And funny enough, it also often is inherited. And it's often inherited from a female to a female. So the chances are that if your mother has it, that, if you have a daughter, then chances are that they would be a synesthetic as well. Okay. But it's not, just to say that, it's not a condition that prevents you from doing stuff. So it's really, comfortable.
It just enhances, I guess, your experience in some way, right?
It can.
It's fascinating. What fascinates me the most nowadays is the fact that to kind of grasp concepts that we cannot imagine. So, recently I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts. Spoiler alert, I'm advertising a podcast on a podcast, but still Radiolab. If you don't know Radiolab, you absolutely should listen to Radiolab. It's a brilliant kind of science-y podcast. And there was a discussion about birds, migratory birds, and scientists are still trying to discover how on earth they know where to go, because it's not very clear. And one of the things they were saying is about the color perception, that most of the birds see more colors than we do. And thinking about more colors is just impossible, right? Because this is really such a concept that, color is color. How can there be more? Yeah. And the same here is like, how can you see colors of something? It's very interesting. And of course, in certain fields of science, you just have to try to understand something without being able to imagine it. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. I think actually one of the things that you learn as a scientist, and it's a great thing if you can master early on, is just to be comfortable with uncertainty. This is one of the things. And they're just things that you can't imagine. And it's okay. For example, if we take the very big numbers, like imagine 1 billion or 1 trillion. I have not done research in that area, but how do you imagine this, right? Yeah. So some things exist just as a pure concept.
So being comfortable in uncertainty.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So we're leaving you with that thought. Good luck. It's not easy. Thank you so much, Mila, for coming today and sharing a little bit of your world with us.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for having me. I had a lot of fun, and I hope that our listeners learned a lot.
I hope so too. A little bit about the numbers from a different side than the usual, I would say. Remember, listeners, of course, we are present on all the social media. So if you want to contact us, please do. Suggest guests, write us. This was Silax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.